All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Wilson-Slocum, and I'm the Administrator for Crisis Services and Justice Initiatives at Integral Care. Integral Care supports adults and children who live with mental illness, substance use disorders, and intellectual and developmental disabilities. We are so glad that you are joining us for our panel today. For your information, this panel presentation is being recorded, and it's also streaming live on Facebook. We're proud to present today's community forum with the Central Texas chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I'd like to welcome Jane Wisnat, who's the area director for the foundation.
Hi, thank you. And we are so excited to be co-hosting this with Integral Care today. As mentioned, I'm Jane Wisnat. I'm the area director for our Central Texas chapter. If you haven't heard of AFSP, we are the leading national nonprofit dedicated to suicide prevention, and our mission is to save lives and to bring hope to those affected by suicide. We do have opportunities for everybody in the community to get involved, with our largest event to do so coming up at the end of October on October 23rd. So feel free to visit afsp.org/Central Texas to see how you can get involved with us, and we are very excited to have you here on this panel with Integral Care. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. The data shows that suicide is the leading cause of death nationwide for people that are ages 15 to 24. Between 2007 and 2018, the suicide rate among adolescents and youth increased by almost 60%. But there's a lot of hope that intervention and prevention really works, and that's why we're here today. I'm honored to welcome our panelists for today's discussion. And I want to get started with Elliott Niblack, who is the CEO of Reality Design Consulting and the Chief Education and Equity Officer at the D. Wood Foundation. His personal experiences with childhood trauma, racism, suicide attempts, and disabling mental health conditions launched him on his professional path. Elliott's career began as a teacher. He then left the classroom to build a behavioral health consulting organization. Welcome, Elliott.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We're also very pleased to have Dr. Amy Grosso, who's the Director of Behavioral Health Services at Round Rock Independent School District. She also serves as the board chair for the Central Texas chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. She is the co-author of the book, School-Wide Collaboration for Transformative Social and Emotional Learning. Welcome, Dr. Grosso. Keisha Martinez is the program manager for Integral Care's Integrated Care in Schools, which provides therapy for students throughout Del Valle, Manor, and Pflugerville districts. She is passionate about serving adolescents and families from diverse populations. She has worked in a variety of settings, including juvenile probation and a local LGBTQ+ youth center. Welcome to Keisha. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge one other group that's with us today, and that's those of you that are on this call who have lost someone to suicide. It is a terrible and complicated grief. We are so sorry for your loss, and we're grateful that you're here with us today. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start with a panel discussion, and then we'll end it with audience questions, probably about the last 10-15 minutes of the hour that we have. As best as we can, we incorporated questions that some of you emailed into us along with your registration to make it a part of the panel presentation. But if you have any other additional questions, please type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We will get to as many as we can. If we run out of time, please make sure to include your email address, and someone from this panel or our communications team will make sure to follow up with you about your question. All right, so let's get started with our panel discussion. So COVID-19 is at the top of everybody's mind, especially as it relates to mental health and kids. We see the pandemic drawing more attention to the topic of mental health, and specifically depression and suicide as it affects kids and adolescents. So Keisha, let's start with you. You and your teams are in the schools. How do you see the pandemic affecting the mental health of the settings that you work in?
Sure, thanks for that question, Laura. And I'm so happy to be here with you all today.
I would say that at the beginning of the pandemic, what we recognized was really high levels of anxiety in students that may not have previously experienced symptoms of anxiety. So a lot of uncertainty, a lot of feelings of being anxious, not knowing what was going to happen, and being taken out of school and being in a remote environment. We also learned how crucial our school staff are, our teachers, our counselors, and helping us identify students that are struggling. And so one of the things that was really interesting is that our referrals in the beginning of the pandemic really decreased, which I think was impacted by students not being on campus, right? And so even though we knew kids were struggling, we didn't exactly have the way to identify them and connect with them in the same way. We were still doing the same work, but our connections were definitely disrupted. As we transitioned back into the school and kind of hitting some sort of normalcy within the school system, we've noticed a lot more students that are struggling with grief. We have so many students that are experiencing grief and loss at levels that we may not have ever seen before. We have students that are experiencing more feelings of isolation and depression. So students are experiencing death and the, I guess, finality of life in ways that their age group has probably never experienced before. So I would say the grief, the feelings of isolation, the uncertainty about their future, and symptoms of depression have definitely increased for students that we're working with.
Thank you, Keisha. That's really interesting that at the beginning of the pandemic, you actually saw your referrals decrease. Makes a lot of sense. When people aren't in person, you do miss a lot, especially with kids and adolescents, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Grosso or Elliott, anything to add from the settings in which you're working?
Yeah, I think I have seen that not necessarily students, but a lot of parents have been more open to talking about mental health in their students. I joke around sometimes that I'll get people saying, did you know mental health is impacting our students? And while I think a lot of people are waking up to that now, that's been the case for so long. Like the rates of suicide, like the suicide statistics for our students have been climbing for over a decade. And so I do think that's a good thing, if we can say a good thing, that parents are actually understanding that mental health is important and that their students are struggling. I also think that the stigma has been reduced some for a parent even to admit their child's struggling, because it feels like we're all struggling, right? And I know we're focused on youth, but parents and adults are struggling right now in new ways that maybe they haven't been. And since we have this collective experience of going through COVID, it's more acceptable to say, I need help, because we all are seeing that we're in this collective struggle. On maybe not the positive side, but I have also seen people trying to really simplify suicide and the reason people are suicidal to one thing, right? Like I have heard people say it is virtual learning. And while that can be a contributing factor, I think it's important for us all to realize that suicide is very highly complex. And there's not one reason at all that someone does have suicidal thoughts or makes an attempt, that it's complex. And that I think it's great that we're having a webinar like this to even give more information out there, and that people are receptive to it, because that stigma has gone down some.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said. I know that recently NPR released an article that talked about if there's a silver lining to this pandemic, it's that people of all ages are actually willing to give counseling a try for the first time in their lives. Say that they don't feel good, or they don't want to continue to feel this way, and not seeing it as a weakness, but just something that we're all talking about more readily. I know nationwide, since the pandemic began, there's been, I think, a 30% increase in emergency room admissions for teenagers and kids for psychiatric reasons, with one of the most common complaints being thoughts of suicide. So thank you. And Elliott, I wonder what you have to add with the spheres that you're working in.
So because I am in a lot of different places, it could be schools, it could be, and that could be differentiated between elementary school, high schools, the collegiate space.
Sure.
And the thing that I see that's, just ubiquitous throughout them all is fear. Fear is driving our media. Fear is driving our actions and our thoughts. And so I see not the emergence of fear, but the strengthening and the more obvious nature of fear, and how now we can all empathize on that end, just like that base level. And so in these education spaces, any space with young people, I see how that manifests, and it might be frustration, but it's not just the child's frustration, because now I see more so even the parents' frustration from not having the access to the resources. I'm seeing parents and hearing parents' frustration just as much as I'm seeing college students' frustration with now being so locked away in our own thoughts. It's very easy, right, to not have all of the supports that we're used to, that we're not even aware of. So on the school space, on the official end, yes, we've seen so many, a lack of the so many reports that we're used to getting. And at the same time, those families and those parents, they're now without the resources, the mental health resources, the food resources, the education resources. So I see that fear, again, more like exploding, but also on that silver lining end, we're here. And I hear from also parents and teenagers and all ages that they are open to this. They want to, and they also want to help each other, which I feel is a big difference. Watching students want to help one another, start programs to help one another.
Wow.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, you have such a unique perspective, Elliott, because you are in so many different aspects of a kid's life, and I would include young adults because you're in the college sphere as well. And it's interesting that frustration and lack of resources tend to be a reality you're seeing across the ages, but also this desire to help one another, which is hopeful. Elliott, I'd like to ask my next question to you. You know, we've established people are talking about mental health more now. That's great. It's unfortunate what it took for us to be having these conversations, but here we are. So a lot of people know what suicide is, but I don't think any of us are educated in school about what warning signs there are for suicide or what risk factors there are for suicide. So what should families be looking for as it relates to kids and teenagers, not just the obvious stuff, but things that are maybe more subtle?
So I'll begin with a direct address to parents or anyone who's a guardian to a young person or has one in their lives, that I can't answer that with a simple answer. I am not your child. I am not you. I'm not a parent like you. And so I don't have that pressure of being the perfect dad. I don't have the pressure of being the perfect parent, because the perfect parent, as we're told, notices everything. They notice every little change in their child's demeanor. They notice every little thing that's going on in school and personal life. That's the image that we're shown. And so parents, it's okay to not be that perfection. It's okay to miss signals or not see something within yourself because we're not used to it and you're not used to it. You're used to having a lot of pressure on you. So with that said, I can only speak from my experience and from what I've been able to talk to directly with young people. And so on the parents' end, I also have to think about, obviously, internalizing my own experience. And for me, I wanted more boundaries. I wanted my parents to show me what it was like to manage their emotions. I wanted to see my dad cry. I wanted to see my mom cry. They were so strong. I wanted to see them talk about what was going on in their lives, both the good things and the negative things. I wanted to have a sense of safety, a sense of control in my life. And so what that manifested as was me controlling my life by isolating myself in my room. What happened with me wanting control was me saying, I don't want to go to these events because when I look at other people, I don't feel like I'm in control. And that manifested also in anger, yelling, not just isolation. Also could lead to like moments of excitement because towards the end phase, because students and young people are saying, I'm having thoughts of suicide, but there's a difference between having thoughts and a plan. And so what parents throughout these conversations that really more so should center on mental health and mental wellness, when it does bridge into that topic of suicide, it's, do you have a plan? I respect your feelings. I want to hear your feelings. I want to share my feelings. And I just want to know if you've thought about how you'll do it. Because at that point, that's when the gauge rises to 10. When it's the thoughts and I haven't come up with a plan, that's a great signal. But asking that question directly is very important. But like I also said, mental health, mental wellness, I wish I had seen adults who were important to me and also showed me that they were human like me and had thoughts like me and how they worked through. Maybe they could ask me advice on what they're going through, making me feel like we can have a conversation between the two of us or the three of us or the five of us or however large the family gathering is. Because if we show children as children what conversations about mental wellness look like, not the technical terms, more just I'm so angry today, I almost did this, but I decided I was going to do this instead, and I gained this, or I made this mistake and it hurts, and even though I wish I could take it back, I have to keep moving forward and know that I'm not my first decision, because we want children to believe that, but until we believe it and show them that, which I wish my parents did, we as young people don't have the examples. I want us to show examples of what it looks like to be mentally well.
Thank you, Elliott. We really appreciate you sharing your experience and really talking about the importance of not just talking, but the modeling piece, so that there's some examples to draw on with experience. Dr. Grosso and Keisha, what are y'all seeing? Like, what would you tell a parent is something you need to look for warning signs, risk factors to add on to what Elliott has shared?
I'll just say, Elliott, I liked how you brought up the idea of being a perfect parent, because that is this pressure. And I've seen a lot of parents feel that if their child is struggling with a mental health concern or suicidal ideation, that they feel like that they failed as a parent and that that's somehow their fault. And I think that's one of the biggest hindrances for parents and guardians to see that the child needs help, because they are seeing that they are a failure at parenting. And that's a hard thing to accept and get over. So realizing that just like our child can struggle with a physical health condition and we know what to look for, that we need to be as comfortable of doing that with mental health. A lot of the warning signs we talk about when it gets to suicide sort of are in three categories, such as mood, behavior, and talk. I'm not going to go deep dive into those. AFSP.org has those listed out in a very detailed way. But I think the biggest thing is that trust your gut if you do notice a change. And as Elliott said, you might not notice everything, but you have to trust if you do see a change. And there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, I've seen something change. I think a lot of times as parents and guardians, especially as kids get to adolescent and those teenage years, we sort of chalk up anything to, well, they're just being a teenager, right? And that if, as Elliott mentioned, if we ourselves as the adults aren't talking about mental health, we can't expect our child to come and talk to us about it. And so being willing to have those hard conversations when you notice something and just trust your gut. We talk about that all the time, especially when we have babies, right? With newborns and stuff, you tell parents like, trust your instincts. And that doesn't go away. And we need to continue to encourage parents and guardians to do that.
Thank you.
I
How
think,
about you?
Sorry.
Sorry.
I was just going to jump on in. That's what I do. I was going to say, I grew up, I don't know I'm not going to make assumptions about anyone else's age here, but I grew up in Generation X with after school specials. And I'll never forget the one, like, even as a therapist, the one that stuck with me every time is, Bobby the teenager giving his, at the time, CDs away to friends. Like, I want you to have this CD and I want you to have this CD. And so I think as everyone's saying, like, there's certain perceptions we have about what someone who's suicidal will look like, right? And we want a checklist, like they're going to give their stuff away and they're going to start saying, that was the other one, they're going to start saying goodbye to everyone. And I think what we've seen over and over again is that it is more subtle, and it is more about a kid who loves sports and is always active in sports or always watching sports, all of a sudden has no interest in it. So it really is the subtle signs. And I love the way Dr. Grosso shared this, but not being afraid to ask when you notice a change with your child, asking those questions. And I always shared in a way of like, just getting curious. Don't ask in a like, well, what are you doing? Like, I noticed you don't like football anymore. But a really curious thing, like, hey, I noticed that you're not hanging out with so-and-so, or I noticed that, you know, you're sleeping more than you used to. And I'm just curious what you think is contributing to that. So if you come in a curious way to your kids and family and friends, because this is across the board, people are more likely to share what's going on with them and what they're experiencing.
You know, the thing that I'm hearing from all three of you is really just if the child or the adolescent has some sort of change, presentation, whether it's emotional, whether it's behavioral, whether it's their interests, their activities, that seems to be the commonality, even if we can't put it in little boxes, that's the commonality. And of course, kids can show, you know, they can change their interests and have some big feelings for a while. And it doesn't mean that they're thinking about suicide or struggling long-term with a mental health problem. But as Elliott and Dr. Grosso have said, it's this kind of trusting your gut and erring to the side of asking about it or seeking help if you're unsure. And while you were talking, two of the things that I really thought of that are well-known warning signs, risk factors for suicide of all ages, not just kids and adults, are really hard to see during the pandemic, which is social withdrawal and isolation. I mean, some people are doing that to be safe during a pandemic. And then also the second one that I was thinking of is the increase in alcohol or drug use. For a teenager, that's could be developmentally normal to experiment. And so it's really hard to know some of the things we've classically looked for beforehand, because there's other reasons someone might be exhibiting that behavior now. So Dr. Grosso, I want to ask you something. I don't know about the rest of you, but I keep hearing in the news and in articles that the pandemic's a time where we can all build resiliency. Kids are resilient. What does that even mean, especially as it relates to mental health and suicide?
You know, and I think it's one of those buzzwords that's going around. And while I am definitely one to focus on like silver linings and what we can get from it, but what does that really mean? And how do we actively do that? And I think sometimes when we think about build resiliency, it's like, let's check it off the list. And now we've done it. I don't have to do it anymore. I mean, at the heart of it, it's how we learn to cope and overcome hard situations, right? I mean, that's the essence of what it means. But what does that really look like for families? What does it look like for parents and guardians? How do we encourage that? And I think sometimes it's even in the little things we do every day. You know, a few years ago, I'd heard a woman speak about how do you let your kids fail, right? That we are so protective of our children and we don't want them to experience any unpleasant emotion or anything, right? So they have to be happy all the time. And that's not reality. Like, life is, we learn to cope with hard emotions. We learn what it is to experience sadness and disappointment and grief, but we have an adult there helping us manage that. And we learn how we can make it through that. And so trying to protect our kids from never feeling anything sad doesn't build resiliency. I think it hampers them. Like, we're setting them up for a life of anxiety in a lot of ways, I think. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic, I did a ton of parent sessions virtually for our families, since parents are now seeing a lot of things that normally an educator or counselor would. And, you know, I kept having, it was about the seniors and like grieving the end of their senior year. And it's like, I just want to make my kid happy. And I was like, you got to accept that your kid's not going to be happy right now. Like, you have to let them grieve. You have to let them be sad. And I'm sorry, doing a parade isn't the same as them going through graduation. And it's okay for them to feel that. But how do we have a trusted adult to be there with them and feel it with them? And I think this goes a lot with what Elliott's saying. Like, I wanted to see parents talk about mental health and what it means to be mentally well. Like, we as adults have to be willing to be vulnerable with students, and vulnerable being, it can be hard for us too. but together we can get through it. So instead of telling your child like, oh, everything's okay, it's not that bad, to be saying, I'm disappointed too. And how do we process those feelings and work through it? And, you know, I sort of view that with going into like protective factors. We talk about protective factors sometimes with mental health and suicide. And one of the biggest things is having a person you can go to, a trusted adult for our students. And if we portray ourselves as subhuman and non-emotional and never struggling, a student's never going to trust us. Our kids aren't going to trust us. And so how do we build this resiliency together? How do we learn to cope with emotions together? And how are we vulnerable in those discussions and not feeling like we have to have all the answers?
Keisha or Elliott, anything you want to add to that?
Definitely. So I love, and I believe that we are all as a society very much so correct to love the concept of resiliency, that idea of we get things done. No matter what comes at us, we get things done, we achieve our goals, we complete our tasks, or we're okay with not completing our tasks, we're okay with continuing on if we feel like we have a sense of failure. But even within that word failure, we're talking now about parents talking about mental wellness, but it's a scary topic because we're always associating it from a fear perspective. And the language that we use around it is language of detriment and deference. You know, we don't want to take on the feelings that we're speaking about, but we also don't want to recognize other feelings aside from sadness when we think about mental health and wellness. And so within the language that we use, moving from a deficiency-based model of language and communication, let's go with strength-based. You know, let's go with it's okay to feel X. I feel sad, and so I am trying my best to build my resiliency, even though I see this, that it hurts. Instead of talking about mental health from oh, you know, how are you feeling only when something negative is happening? It's, hey, I just heard you screaming because you were so happy about something with a video game. What was that about? What did you achieve? Because that's mental wellness too. If we're concerned about the video game, just linking back to something that Keisha said with asking if they're okay and what time to do that, asking during a session of video games, which has seen a huge increase, and especially with those competitive games that build a lot of anger and aggression and violence, like countering that with a sense of, hey, even within this very activity, there are still the positive and healthy things to look out for: teamwork, feelings of accomplishment, so on. So not taking such a hard stance on certain things that we perceive as destructive, and instead looking for the constructive parts within it, because then it becomes, hey, you know, this pandemic is coming to a close. You might want to get together with your friends now. Imagine how that would feel. You know, you're actually seeing each other instead of just playing the game, adding to friendship. So yeah, using strength-based words and words of resiliency, not no excuses language, because that's another danger that resiliency as a concept has led to. I see it in certain schools. We have this no excuses policy. I'm very thankful that that's starting on its way out. But the concept of resiliency isn't no excuses. It's simply strength, and you're moving forward.
Thank you, Elliott. Keisha.
No way, man, that was great. I think you all hit on everything that's really important.
Thank you. Thank you, Keisha. Okay, so we know that as it relates to mental health, physical health, and then certainly suicide, that early intervention is really key. You have your outcomes, the earlier you can intervene, mental health problems, with suicide, with physical health problems. So Elliott, I would really like your perspective as a person with lived experience regarding suicide and as a professional working with kids and young people. How can family members help kids feel more comfortable to talk about things like mental health, but specifically suicide? Elliott, you are muted.
I was doing so well with it too.
We weren't going to be able to have a virtual panel without saying it at least one time. So thank you. We've gotten it out of the way now.
Right. I'm that guy. Okay, that guy. So I would say that approach first approach the conversations under the understanding that every conversation does not have to be direct. What we say around us and how we're speaking around our children influences what they perceive as acceptable to talk about and safe to talk about. So I don't have to specifically ask if my child is okay. It's, how was your day? It was okay. That usual response. And when they, how are you doing? Like, well, I had maybe I had some problems with some coworkers. Maybe I don't want to add names in there because I don't want to disrespect anybody, but being open and talking about that. If you have a child in front of you, but their brother or sister is in the back, they also hear this conversation. If you're talking with your partner about something, fear with the bills, but how we're going to work together and get through this and keep the anxiety low, children around you are going to hear that too and feel safe having those conversations, either when you approach them or they approach you. And when that does happen, they do have those direct conversations, make it them-centered. Still take ownership of our own feelings and our own emotions and speak on those, but do so in a way that isn't your child is your therapist, but you are not also your child's therapist. If you need, or your child needs a therapist, that's a time that, and they're going to talk about this, further in this right now. But in general, conversations, building an atmosphere where they feel safe and comfortable doing it, and then sharing feelings or sharing statements of strength without asking them or expecting them to have a response. Being comfortable making statements, walking away with that feeling of reciprocity makes them feel safe of saying, I feel this way. I don't want your advice. I don't want, any of that. I just want someone to listen. And that's going to give them that feeling of openness as well, because it did for me.
So it sounds like what you're saying is it's this need for this ongoing conversation. It's not a one and done. It's this sort of relationship where this is a thing that we talk about and it's okay. And it's revisiting it as needed. And it's just part of the relationship is what it sounds like to me that you're saying. Okay. You're on mute again. I'm sorry to have to tell you.
That guy times two. It's all about exactly that. The conversation and not waiting until the one breaking point, it seems, comes up. But when it does, still keeping those things in mind.
Thank you. Keisha, what do you have to add to that?
Sure. So, one of my friends has implemented at the dinner table with her now 7-year-old, their rose and thorn of every day. So the rose is the positive, the thorn is maybe something that was upsetting or annoying, or they had to do something they didn't want to do. So I agree with Elliott 100% that having regular conversations about emotions and feelings, and adults having those conversations today, like he has stopped our dinners several times to say, what was your rose and thorn? And so implementing even that small process, that may sound cheesy, but when you're sharing a meal together, being able to talk about this really great thing happened today and this not so great thing happened today. And if you're open, sharing what the not so great thing was about and maybe how you responded to it or how you wish you would have responded to it. But creating an environment where emotions aren't shameful things to experience, but emotions are real things, and we learn how to manage them as they come up through individual coping skills or familial coping skills is really crucial. And so that's part of the early intervention, but it's also the pre-intervention, is that the right term? Wait, what's the right word? What am I looking for?
Prevention.
Prevention. Pre-intervention isn't a word. Thank you very much.
I liked your word, and I think you need to copyright it.
Yeah, so the prevention portion of it is just creating regular conversations about emotions and letting kids know how you feel right now is okay. You can feel however you feel. And we're going to work through that together, or we're going to find some coping skills that may help you manage this emotion. So instead of being a 10, you're an 8, right?
Right. So Dr. Grosso, I think Elliott and Keisha have really addressed the prevention piece, right? The work you put in before it becomes a crisis, and as National Alliance for Mental Illness as plan for a crisis before there's a crisis, right? And that's the whole idea behind prevention. What would you say families can do to help facilitate conversations if they're concerned about their kids from an intervention standpoint? Like, let's say a kid is really indicating, or they're very concerned that suicide is something on the kid's mind. What's the right way to talk to your child about that?
No, and I think, as much as we do want to do the preventative, like there can be times, I mean, and for the parents out there that you're like, oh my gosh, I haven't been doing these things. It's okay, right? Like you can start at any time. But, if you do have just this idea, like, I do think my child is thinking of killing themselves. A few things. First, it's the biggest myth that if you ask about it, you're planting the seed in someone's head. Like that myth has been disproven. Research actually shows us that it's the exact opposite. By asking, we actually open the door for people to get help and intervention in a crisis moment. Second, as a parent, I can't imagine how hard it is asking that question. I have an 8-year-old right now that has, and I talk about suicide all the time, right? Like, but that would still be really hard. But I want for parents and guardians to realize that if you're thinking of how hard that is to ask your child, imagine how hard it is for them to come and talk to you because you have made it an off topic, or maybe you've even made jokes about suicide, or made some, not intentionally, but some very stigmatizing comments about suicide when there's been a celebrity who died. Maybe you talked about how selfish they were and you can't believe they would do something like that. So then you're expecting your child to be able to approach you. And so I think that's where it is. Like, you have to be willing to ask the hard question and just be able to say, I'm really worried about you. Are you thinking, having thoughts of wanting to kill yourself? And knowing if they are, you have opened the door to have a conversation. And if they're not, maybe you've opened the door to a different conversation that needs to be had. And so I think that's the biggest thing. I think too often, and I am so glad we have hotline numbers in the text line, like 1-800-273-TALK, going to go to a 3-digit number in July, 741-741, like those are great. But to think that our only responsibility is to tell someone to call that number if they're struggling, or for them to seek help out. No. We have to be the ones to open the door. And I think that is what's missing sometimes.
Dr. Grosso, I appreciate what you said, because I'm a parent of 2 young kids and also a professional who trains suicide risk assessment for first responders. So I have this foot in both worlds. And I'm supposed to be someone that's very comfortable with talking about suicide and specifically how you ask someone about it. And man, when I heard my kid sometime in the past year use the word suicide, and it was clear he had heard it in a video game, to speak to what you were talking about, Elliott, and didn't know what it meant, he was using it. I felt myself freeze. Like, oh my God, I have to tell my 8-year-old, who's now 9, what suicide means. What if that makes him think about it? And I caught myself and I thought, oh my gosh, this is all the stuff I teach against. But as a parent, I went into a very different mode. I also want to just take a moment to make sure to talk to anyone listening, parent, teacher. I know there's some first responders on. You want to be very aware of how you're asking questions, even if you're saying it clearly. I've seen multiple medical staff over the years go, now you don't want to kill yourself, right? Or do you want to hurt yourself? It's you're kind of coaching the kid on what to say, or at the very least, you're doing what Dr. Grosso was talking about, which is teaching them don't really answer this question because I don't know what to do with the answer. I really appreciate that. And I want to make sure to say to the parents on here, even though this is something I professionally specialize in, it does not feel natural talking to my kids about this. So it's really hard. And I think it's something as parents we have to practice, because it's on us to at least start those conversations. As Elliott keeps saying, all the modeling, we're the adult. So anyway, I don't mean to take up so much time, but I wanted to say I appreciate what all 3 of you have said about that as a professional and as a parent. So the next question I have, you all have kind of led us to this next question, which is the role of family in a child's mental health. And that could mean parents, it could be chosen family, it could be guardians.
Mhm.
We know that supporting the family through a child's mental health episode or a suicide crisis is critical. So Dr. Grosso, with you being in Round Rock ISD, what types of educations, tools, or resources do you provide parents or recommend parents have to help support them?
I think that's when we do have a crisis type of situation, or even before a crisis, of really wraparound services for the family. Is it even just a level of education? NAMI Central Texas has some great parent classes on how you support your adolescent. So those are great options. We try to do just a lot of basic, what is mental health? What does it mean? We have a generation of students who are a lot more comfortable talking about mental health than it was even 10 years ago. And I have to remind that parents, we didn't grow up this being an okay topic. So how do we surround them to give them this information? How so many of us have been raised in different cultures and religions that are have very specific ideas about mental health and mental illness. And so I think just providing all of these opportunities, and also letting the parents know, like, if your child has gone through a suicidal crisis, it's okay for you to seek counseling on your own.
Mhm.
Right? That's a lot to handle. And there's a lot of emotions and feelings that are coming up for you. And what a great example you're being for your child, that they're broken and need fixing. Instead, you're saying we all go through things that we need some support outside of our family. And so I think that just being that person and realizing within yourself, it's okay if you need help too.
Mhm.
Thank you. Elliott, I'm really curious to know what your input is on this question.
So I go back to my desire to use strength-based language and ideology. And so within that idea of being broken, right? And there's nothing wrong, so to speak, with thinking that or using those words. It's more so, how am I perceiving my child? Am I perceiving my child as something that needs repair? Am I thinking about my child as a pane of glass, or am I thinking about them as something similar to glass, like a orb, right? We have an orb of glass and it's super strong and it's perfect when they enter the world, right? And then over time, the immense pressure and heat that we all feel starts to mold that orb, right? Next thing you know, light isn't passing through it perfectly. It's having difficulty moving forward. It's difficult to hold. It's difficult to carry because it's so awkward and odd. And so approaching these conversations from a space of, hey, well, you know what? Let's take this pressure and this heat and this resiliency and now start putting that orb back to its original state, but even stronger with that light coming through even more. And so I know for me, in reference to like the intervention space, I wanted people to call me out on how I was feeling. I wanted, especially on the physical one, I wanted someone to tell me, oh, hey, notice you're gaining weight right now. And this was the big one in college, the stress eating, or for others, the lack of stress eating. Asking those questions when noticing things like that. Also in terms of child support with parents, advocate in the schools. I can tell you, as someone who had suicidal ideation as early as middle school, and as someone who had 2 attempts in college, so during my later adolescence, I didn't learn about any of this in school. I wish that there was a comfortable space to talk about these things. And so parents will very quickly come to a school and say, oh, my child did not get this grade, or why did my child get this letter sent home? Something with anger or wanting their child to do better. That's where the space comes from. So now it's, hey, let's recognize that there is only one social worker in the school. Or, hey, it's great that we ordered 2 and 3, but there's still 300 students in the school. Advocate to the principal, advocate to the school psychologist, school therapist. Ask/demand for access for students to have the classes that revolve around SEL, but also advocate for the teacher's ability to have these lessons. Because as an ex-teacher, I remember teaching in one grade where we had these SEL lessons, but we had to go through them really quick, 10 minutes, maybe 15, because the rest of the time we needed that early time for test prep. Test prep still gets in the way. I love how we're talking about it's not so much. However, it still is going to affect, because after all is said and done, the teachers have to get these test scores in. So advocate for them well, advocate for student-led initiatives within school, because they're the ones who are peers and can help each other the best. Speak out and up for your child, ask for help, and then demand care, the proper care be taken, because no one entered the profession of education to want to hurt children, I like to believe. So then they want to listen to what you say your children need from a strength-based model, and putting that onus of responsibility on them to take care of one another, and then us supporting them in that attempt, not us doing it for them.
I love that. Thank you, Elliott. Keisha, what are some of the resources and education you and your teams provide to families?
Sure. One thing that I think is really important, I always like to leave a conversation like this with resources. And so we have 2 resources that we are going to email to all the participants after this. But one of the things I noticed as a school-based therapist when I first started with the agency, and then as the program manager, is we have kids share with us that they're thinking of suicide. And we have to contact the parent and say, your kid just expressed that they want to kill themselves, or your kid is experiencing suicidal ideation, which may not be language the parent knows or uses, and you need to come to the school immediately. And we would get so many varying reactions from parents, but I can't imagine as a parent getting a phone call from my school that my kid said they want to kill themselves and I need to come pick them up and take them to a hospital, right? And so one of the things that was really important when I was a part of the Kids Living Well group was making sure parents understood what their rights were. Oftentimes the schools would demand that before the kid came back, they needed to be released from that. They needed all the release paperwork from the hospital. So we don't know, we want to know their diagnosis. We want to know the treatment plan. We want to know their medications. And so one of the documents we created was knowing your rights. And so knowing within that realm, what do you have to provide to the school? What's required of you to provide? Not that that information isn't helpful, but as a parent, what rights do you have regarding the information about your child? So that's one of the documents we created. The other one was just how to help you through that process. So your kid's going through a crisis, and what are tips to help you respond? And so I was really proud of being a part of that process, because I saw over and over and over the devastation for parents, or wait, I'm sorry, I sent them to school and they were happy. What are you talking about, right? Mm-hmm. And so that shock from parents, or the fear that they experience that may have come out in an expression of anger. And so I think as providers in the school system, it's really important that we're also partnering with the families and supporting them through this process. So walking with them through the outcry, the potential hospitalization, and then the aftercare. And so the documents that we created, I think, do a pretty good job of helping you with those steps, knowing what you do and don't have to provide, knowing what might be helpful to provide, and knowing how you now handle knowing this new information about your child and the fear about their safety.
Keisha, thank you so much. And thank you for sharing those resources with everyone on this panel. I can only imagine when a child is in crisis that there's just so many things swirling in your head, and it's keep track of things. As Elliott pointed out, we're not taught how to handle these things. And it's really important parents know hospitals are not the only place to assess a child who's in crisis. In fact, that's really a place of last resort. Yep. Time to talk a lot about today, and I know your resources touch on, but I really appreciate that you're sharing that resource. That's a really concrete tool I think people can take away. So I want to give the audience a reminder. If you have any questions you want to type into the chat, please go ahead and do that. I see one. So I'm going to ask a final question of the panel, and then I will get to the questions in the chat with our short remaining time. So the last formal question I have, I'd like to start with you, Keisha. Before we head into the Q&A, I'd like for you to talk about what parents should know about this term, culturally responsive care. I think we've heard that term a lot lately too, although not quite as much as resiliency. So what do parents need to know about what that is? And how does that impact the therapeutic relationship that their kid has with a counselor?
Sure. I think it's really important to acknowledge a really good percentage of the helping field is white people, so people that are not people of color. And a really good portion of the people seeking help, especially in the education system, are BIPOC families, so families of color. And so oftentimes, as a family of color, you may be sitting across from someone that doesn't look like you and thinking, how in the heck can you relate to anything that I'm experiencing? And what I encourage with my clinicians and for myself is that we talk about that elephant in the room. So I am a person of color. You are not a person of color. How do we have this conversation? What do we need to do? And maybe even what trainings have you had in equitable care? Really talking about having real conversations. If we're going to talk about suicide, we got to be able to talk about race. And I think that people are more open about these conversations, and it's crucial that you're able to do that. Now, this doesn't mean that if you have a therapist that doesn't look like you, that they can't serve you. But a culturally responsive provider is going to be able to have that conversation, is going to be able to talk through conversations about race and differences in other areas, maybe socioeconomic status, privilege as a whole. But those need to be conversations that you have together. Otherwise, that relationship, the whole point of therapy is to provide connection and a healing relationship. And if we're not able to have these conversations, we're not going to be able to connect, and we're not going to be able to provide any healing. So just knowing, you can ask about that. Don't be afraid to have those conversations and approach them in a way in which, how do we build our connection despite our backgrounds or our visible differences?
Thank you, Keisha. Dr. Grosso, anything you want to add to that?
I think, speaking of the therapeutic relationship, and if your child is going to a therapist, to know as the parent, and this is hard for parents, you're not going to be in there all the time, right? Sometimes they might check in at the beginning or every once in a while, but that's your child's safe space. And, you know, the therapist will work with your child. And if there are things they need to share with you, it might take them a while to have the courage to do that. But realizing, I've talked with parents before and they're like, but I want to know everything that's said. No, like, that, you know, as hard as that is as a parent, and I get that, it's they're in this emotional space that they need someone that's just for them, right? And that it's going to help them be able to voice the things that maybe they haven't been able to voice to you, and work through those things. And so you have to be understanding of that. And like, if you've taken on outpatient or something and they get in the car, you can't be like, what did you talk about? Right? Like you can offer a listening environment without grilling, because that's not going to help.
That's a really good point, and understandable curiosity on a parent's part. That's not very helpful. Elliott, I wanted to know if you have any comments on this.
Yes, and I'll try my best to keep them brief because I genuinely want to hear these questions. So another aspect of culturally responsive care that goes beyond direct communication is understanding that there are cultural differences. There is no, so I at my organization do a training called Educated Empathy, and that centers on seeing familiarity and signs of shared relationships, shared ideas. And within the culturally responsive care model, that also includes recognizing that this child in front of me, unfortunately, due to racial designation, is going to have lesser access to a variety, a diverse population of therapists. And it's not that it's okay, it's that there is still, like Dr. Grosso just said, a high level of value within simply the conversation between the therapist because I have had a therapist every year of my life since I was 12 years old. And when I was 12, it was Miss Sandy. And Miss Sandy was the short, a short Jewish woman who, you look at her, she would look like the typical social worker that doesn't really know her caseload. No, if I did not have this short Jewish woman in my life, I would not be here. If I did not have a white male psychiatrist, or just simply put, a psychiatrist, it didn't matter that he was a white male. He responded to me in a responsive manner. I did not have my first Black therapist until my most recent one. And he was perfect in that time of my life because I had all this wonderful information and counseling. And now I had somebody who looked like me and understood what I was going through. Each one of those people and more in between, they didn't all have to look like me, but I also know that my parents and other parents should be aware that there are those differences and to always follow up, because if you don't feel like your child is being served in a way that is responding to their needs, especially that cultural need that you have to identify as a parent yourself, then it's okay to switch therapists. There are people who switch therapists all the time, and that's okay too. Just staying aware and recognizing that, yes, race does have influence, but it is not the definition of what would make a good therapist.
Yeah, Elliott, you bring up such a good point. I can't count how many times in my personal life and career I've heard people say, well, I tried therapy and the therapist was terrible and I just gave up. And the response that I copied from someone, I think I got it in graduate school, is, well, if you get a bad haircut, do you never get your haircut again? No, you find someone else that gets your hair and gives you a good haircut. This could have been a whole panel, this last question asked. So I really appreciate all the different responses to that question that, again, we could have talked about for 3 hours. In our 4 minutes left, I want to focus on one question in the chat and quickly address the other two. One was a question about, will this recording be available? Yes, I believe at some point. It's usually a week or two, but the recording will be available and emailed to all participants that registered, I believe. Second question was about, hey, well, if hospitals are not the only place that a kid can be assessed, where can I get my kid assessed? We will make sure to include that in all the resources that are emailed out after this, because we don't have time to go through that list today, but it will include crisis helplines, mobile crisis teams, psychiatric urgent care clinics, things of that nature. The question I want to get to, it's really very important question, is a parent who said their child has confided into them or to them that they are thinking about killing themselves. And they have begged that parent to keep it a secret, to keep it confidential from the other parent. The parent is asking, how do I keep my child's trust, but still get my child help? Dr. Grosso, want to start with?
I was like, everybody's like, I think the first thing is when we're talking about somebody in suicidal crisis or suicidal ideation, we can't promise them that we're not going to tell someone, right? That even as a therapist, that's grounds of breaking confidentiality. And it is to keep the person safe. And so I think, how can the mom talk with the child about, getting help is going to be a whole family process, right? Because it's our family unit, and we're going to have to support you through this in the same way. If you were physically sick, we would get you help, and all of us would need to be part of supporting you. That's the same here. And so I try really hard as much as I can to equate mental health and physical health, right? Because if it was a physical health condition someone was in, we would be like, we have to tell at least our family unit kind of thing. And so trying to make that connection with mental health, and then realizing that there's a lot to unpack there of why someone wouldn't want their other parent to know, that through therapy and through some family counseling, that could be really helpful and hopefully a good process.
Yeah, I think really quickly, I love that. I would also like to add that is a lot for you to carry on your own. And if something were to happen, there would be a ton of guilt connected to the fact that you knew and you didn't share it with your partner. And so I would really encourage you to have a conversation about safety and about love and about connection, and how you all can have the conversation together with the other partner. So it's not breaking the trust. It's not keeping her secret, but it's how do we have this conversation as a family? Because I think it's really important, just as Dr. Grosso said, that we walk through this together as a family unit. But that is way too much to carry on your own, and just makes me feel really sad for you that you're already dealing with it on your own. And I hope that you'll find a way to get some support so that this isn't the weight that you're carrying.
I definitely want to add in that having a very straightforward question, such as, I'm sorry, not question, statement, before anything happens, but especially now in this situation. As a teacher, I would always say that I love you all. I want to do my best to take care of you. And I know that sometimes we feel uncomfortable and sometimes we feel scared to share things. And I don't want you to think that. I want you to know that no matter what you tell me, I'm going to try my best to do the best for you. I'm going to try my best to keep you safe. Any reaction, anything I do after what you share with me. I love you. So let's keep it moving. And I repeat that through over time so that they internalize it, to have them, it doesn't erase their questions or their fear, so to speak, but it does leave me open to their information, their thoughts, because they know, hey, Mr. Niblack, Elliott, he just has my best interest in mind. So they don't think about the hiding part, they think about the sharing more.
Thank you all. And I'm being mindful of the time. I do want to say to the parent who wrote that, what a gift that your child trusted you to tell you that they're thinking about killing themselves. I know it doesn't feel that way.
Yep.
This is a horrible thing to hear, but this, as everyone on the panel said, this is how things can start to turn around. So what a good parent you are that your child trusted you. That really is a gift, and I'm sorry you're going through this. Please feel free to reach out to our crisis helpline, 512-472-4357, to call at any time to talk about this further. Before I wrap up, there's one more question we're not going to be able to get to today, which is a question that can have a lot of conversation, which is if you know your child is experiencing suicidal thoughts, should you call the school to share that with the school in the spirit of working together? We will respond to you via email with that, the different perspectives from the people on the panel. I hate to not spend time answering that question, but I know a bunch of people are jumping off and have to get to things at one. I want to thank all of the amazing panelists today, Keisha, Elliott, Dr. Grosso, for sharing their experience, both professional and personal. It really was an honor to hear from all three of you. I want to thank everyone who took time on their lunch break today to join us to learn about this really critical issue. And I hope that we have struck the balance of explaining to you the gravity of the situation, but instilling the very real hope that prevention and intervention are extremely effective with teenagers thinking of suicide. When the forum ends in just the next minute, you guys will be prompted to take a short survey to give us some feedback about how we did today, things that we did well, things that we can do better for the next forum. And we do hope you'll take the time to complete that survey if you are able to and if you would like to. So on behalf of the esteemed panelists, thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. There will be an email following in the weeks to come with the recording of this panel and the resources that Keisha and the other panelists talked about. Thank you. Be well.